Today's topic is when silence destroys the ego. To understand this, we must first understand what the ego truly is. The ego is not confidence. It is not healthy self-esteem. The ego is the constructed identity that depends on recognition, reaction, and reinforcement. It survives on response. It grows through attention. It stabilizes itself by controlling narratives and outcomes. When someone argues back, defends themselves, explains repeatedly, or tries to prove their worth, the ego feels validated. Even conflict feeds it. But something extraordinary happens when there is silence. Silence removes emotional fuel. In emotional intelligence, one of the highest forms of mastery is self-regulation. It is the ability to pause instead of react, to observe instead of explode, to detach instead of defend. When a person chooses silence, they are not being weak. They are interrupting the emotional cycle. They are refusing to participate in unconscious patterns. And this refusal is deeply destabilizing to any ego that depends on reaction for survival. Ego expects resistance. It expects emotional movement. It expects noise. Silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates discomfort. When there is no reaction, the ego begins to question itself. It starts searching for validation that no longer arrives. It attempts to provoke, to trigger, to regain control. But the absence of response forces a confrontation, not with another person, but with itself. This is where transformation begins. Silence is not passive. It is active awareness. It is the space where emotional clarity develops. When you remain silent instead of reacting impulsively, you are strengthening neural pathways associated with reflection rather than aggression. You are choosing long-term dignity over short-term emotional release. That choice rewires behavior. And here is the deeper truth. Silence exposes insecurity. An ego that is secure does not need constant validation. It does not panic in the absence of applause. But a fragile ego cannot tolerate being ignored. It interprets silence as rejection, loss of control, or invisibility. And in that space, its instability becomes visible. Silence holds a mirror. When you refuse to engage in unnecessary battles, you communicate something powerful without words. My self-worth is not dependent on this exchange. That message unsettles anyone who relies on dominance or emotional reaction to feel significant. Because power built on reaction collapses when reaction disappears. But silence is not about punishing others. It is about protecting your emotional energy. Emotional intelligence teaches us that attention is a resource. Where attention goes, energy flows. When you withdraw attention from toxic dynamics, you reclaim cognitive and emotional space. That space allows for growth, clarity, and resilience. The destruction of the ego through silence is not dramatic. It is quiet, gradual, psychological. It forces introspection. It removes distraction. It creates stillness, and stillness is uncomfortable for those who avoid self-awareness. However, for the emotionally intelligent individual, silence becomes strength. It becomes a boundary. It becomes composure. It becomes maturity. Instead of proving yourself repeatedly, you allow your consistency to speak. Instead of defending your value, you embody it. Instead of chasing validation, you cultivate internal stability. And here is the most important lesson. Silence must come from awareness, not suppression. Suppression hides emotion. Silence rooted in awareness is calm. Silence rooted in fear is avoidance. The difference lies in intention. When silence is intentional, it signals growth. In leadership, in relationships, in personal development, the ability to remain centered during provocation reflects high emotional intelligence. It shows that your identity is internally anchored, that your self-concept does not collapse when challenged. When silence destroys the ego, it does not destroy confidence. It destroys dependency on reaction. It destroys insecurity masked as dominance. It destroys the illusion that noise equals power. True power is composure. And when you master silence, you master yourself. Because the loudest person in the room often seeks control, but the calmest person in the room already has it. To understand how silence can dismantle the ego, we must begin by recognizing that the ego is a psychological structure built on external reinforcement. It is shaped through feedback, attention, comparison, and reaction. From early development, individuals learn to define themselves through how others respond to them. Praise strengthens identity, criticism threatens it, and conflict often intensifies it. The ego, therefore, becomes dependent on engagement, whether positive or negative, because both forms confirm its presence. When someone reacts emotionally, by defending, arguing, explaining excessively, or seeking validation, they are participating in a cycle that sustains the structure. Silence interrupts that cycle. In the absence of reaction, there is no immediate feedback loop to stabilize the ego. This absence creates psychological tension because the expected exchange does not occur. The individual who relies on control or emotional stimulation may begin to feel uncertain, anxious, or destabilized. Silence removes the emotional cues that help them orient themselves socially. From an emotional intelligence perspective, intentional silence reflects self-regulation and awareness. It is the ability to tolerate discomfort without impulsive expression. Instead of escalating conflict, silence creates cognitive space for reflection. It allows the nervous system to settle rather than amplify. Over time, this withdrawal of reaction forces the ego to confront its own insecurity. Without external stimulation, underlying fears of inadequacy or loss of significance may surface. In this way, silence acts as a mirror, revealing the dependency that was previously hidden beneath noise and activity. The power of silence lies not in avoidance, but in conscious change. It signals that self-worth is internally anchored rather than externally negotiated. When reaction disappears, the ego cannot sustain itself in the same way, and what remains is either genuine confidence or exposed fragility. When silence replaces reaction, it introduces a psychological disruption that many people are unprepared to handle. Most interpersonal dynamics operate on predictable emotional exchanges, stimulus and response, action and counteraction. The ego thrives in this predictability because it allows for control, influence, and reassurance. When a person provokes and receives a reaction, even a negative one, their sense of impact is confirmed. Silence breaks that confirmation. Without verbal defense, emotional escalation, or visible frustration, there is no evidence that the provocation achieved its intended effect. This absence can create cognitive dissonance, a state where expectations no longer align with reality. The mind begins searching for explanations. Did the silence signal indifference, superiority, emotional withdrawal, or strength? The ambiguity itself becomes destabilizing. For an ego that depends on visibility and acknowledgement, being met with calm detachment feels like invisibility. Invisibility challenges identity. It forces the individual to confront the possibility that their influence is not as powerful as assumed. Over time, this lack of reinforcement weakens the behavioral patterns that once felt dominant. At a deeper level, silence shifts the center of gravity within a relationship. Instead of power being distributed through emotional intensity, it becomes grounded in composure. The person who maintains silence is not surrendering. They are exercising restraint. Restraint requires awareness of one's emotional triggers and the discipline to pause rather than react impulsively. Neuroscientifically, this pause allows higher cognitive functions associated with reasoning and empathy to remain engaged instead of allowing stress responses to take control. The ego, however, interprets the absence of emotional engagement as loss of leverage. When attempts to provoke fail repeatedly, frustration may increase, revealing insecurity that was previously masked by confidence. Silence, therefore, becomes a diagnostic tool. It exposes whether one's identity is rooted in internal stability or external validation. The longer silence is sustained with clarity and intention, the more it communicates self-possession. It demonstrates that emotional energy is being conserved rather than scattered. In that conservation lies a quiet authority that no argument can easily overpower. As silence continues over time, its impact becomes less about the immediate interaction and more about long-term psychological transformation. The ego initially reacts to silence with confusion or agitation, but if the silence is consistent and grounded in awareness, it begins to erode habitual patterns of emotional dependency. Human behavior is reinforced through repetition. When certain actions reliably produce attention or control, they become ingrained. Silence removes that reinforcement. Without the expected payoff of reaction, the behaviors driven by ego gradually lose their effectiveness. This process can feel uncomfortable because it strips away familiar roles. The individual who once relied on dominance, persuasion, or emotional intensity may feel a loss of identity. Yet this discomfort is not destructive in itself. It is revealing. It exposes the gap between authentic self-worth and constructed self-importance. Silence creates a reflective space in which that gap becomes visible. For the person practicing silence, the transformation is equally significant. Remaining composed in the face of provocation requires emotional literacy, the ability to recognize one's feelings without being controlled by them. Instead of suppressing anger or hurt, the emotionally intelligent individual acknowledges these emotions internally while choosing not to externalize them impulsively. This distinction is critical. Suppression builds pressure, but conscious restraint builds strength. Over time, the nervous system adapts to this pattern of measured response, increasing resilience and reducing reactivity. The result is not emotional coldness, but emotional stability. Relationships begin to reorganize around the stability. Interactions become more intentional, less chaotic. Those who are willing to engage with maturity adjust to the new dynamic, while those dependent on drama often withdraw. In this way, silence does not simply dismantle the ego of another. It refines the character of the one who practices it. It shifts the focus from winning arguments to maintaining integrity. It replaces the need to be heard immediately with the confidence that one's value does not diminish in quiet moments. What emerges from sustained, intentional silence is clarity, a clearer understanding of boundaries, priorities, and inner strength. Ultimately, the sustained practice of intentional silence leads to a restructuring of how power and identity are understood. In many social environments, power is equated with dominance, persuasion, or the ability to command attention. Yet these forms of power are often fragile because they depend on continuous external engagement. When silence is introduced and maintained with awareness, it reveals a different model of strength, one rooted in internal regulation rather than external control. The ego resists this model because it cannot easily measure or manipulate it. Without visible emotional reactions, there is no leverage point. Over time, this lack of access compels a reckoning. Either the individual adapts by developing deeper self-awareness, or they escalate attempts to provoke a response. In both cases, silence functions as a boundary that protects psychological energy and clarifies relational dynamics. For the person embodying silence, the long-term effect is an increased sense of coherence. Coherence occurs when thoughts, emotions, and actions align. Instead of reacting to every stimulus, responses become deliberate. This deliberation strengthens executive functioning and reduces impulsivity. As a result, communication, when it does occur, carries greater weight. Words are fewer but more intentional. Others begin to perceive stability rather than volatility. This perception alters the emotional climate of interactions. Calmness often diffuses tension more effectively than confrontation because it does not feed escalation. The ego, deprived of drama, gradually loses its grip on the narrative of superiority or victimhood. Silence also fosters introspection. In the absence of constant exchange, both parties are left with their own thoughts. This internal space can lead to growth if embraced. The individual who once relied on external affirmation may begin questioning underlying insecurities. Meanwhile, the one practicing silence gains clarity about personal limits and values. Over time, relationships either mature into mutual respect or dissolve due to incompatibility with emotional accountability. In either outcome, silence has served its purpose. It has dismantled illusion, redirected energy inward, and reinforced the principle that true authority is expressed not through noise, but through composed self-mastery.